Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tokyo College online public lecture. My name is Mino. I'm Deputy Director of Tokyo College, and I'm very happy to serve as your moderator for today's session. You may have seen some very nice pretty picture of birds in our poster or our advertisement of today's event. And you may imagine that the main character of today's talk will be birds. And that's true. However, the main topic, main issue of today's lecture is neural circuits, neural system, and social bonding. As you can see from the title of today's lecture, which is Uncovering the Neural Circuits for Social Bonding in Songbirds. Today's lecturer, Dr. WOOLLEY, is Associate Professor at Department of Biology, McGill University in Canada. And Salah has been doing research on neural mechanism underlying the production and perception of social communication behavior of songbirds. Salah is now staying at Tokyo College as a visiting scholar and collaborating with IRCN, which is International Research Center for Neurointelligence of the University of Tokyo. Now, Salah is going to introduce some outcomes of her recent research on songbirds and social bonding in today's lecture. After the lecture, I would like to invite Professor SAKURA Osamu, who is as commentator, and Dr. SAKURA is professor at the Interfaculty Initiative in Information Studies, the Joho Gakkan of University of Tokyo. And after the Q&A between these two scholars, I would like to pick up some questions from the audience. And so if you have any questions, please send your questions to us by using the question function of the webinar. Okay, we have very limited time, so let's get started. And Salah, I think you're ready. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Right, so thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm excited to tell you about some of the work that we've done recently, trying to figure out what the neural circuits are for social bonding. So we humans are highly social creatures. We form bonds with our partners and our families. We form them with our siblings and our friends, with our colleagues and our coworkers. And we even actually form bonds with other species, other animal species. And these bonds are incredibly important for our day-to-day lives and our well-being. And indeed, in instances where there's isolation or we have an inability to form or maintain these bonds, that can lead to detriments in our mental health, so things like depression. In order to form and maintain these bonds, we require communication. And that means that any issues that we might have in our sensory systems that lead to poor communication, so things like deficits in hearing that happen with aging, are often associated with things like neurodegenerative disease. So it's really fundamental for us to understand how it is that we form and maintain social bonds and what the neural processes are that underlie that. So that's what my lab has been studying for the past decade or so, but we study it in these songbirds here. So these are zebra finches, and they are a highly social species of bird. So they live in large flocks in grasslands and deserts in Australia. And in addition to living in these large groups, male and female birds will form lifelong pair bonds. So shown in this picture, here on the right is a male. He has a bright orange cheek patch and some zebra stripes and some spots on the side. And in white is a female. So females can be different colors, but they generally have less decoration. And so this male and this female can form a lifelong pair bond. And that's important for their ability to survive and to reproduce. And what it means is that among a flock of birds, that male and female will recognize each other using sight and sound, so using visual and audio cues. And so they're able to recognize each other. And then they'll also prefer their mate over other birds in the flock. And so in order to form and maintain their pair bond, they use vocal communication. So males and females will produce different sounds, and they use that to keep in contact with each other when they're out and about. But in addition, male zebra finches also produce a special vocalization, and that's known as the song. So for example, this male here might produce a song that sounds like this. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so each song that the male birds produce are unique. And so a male might produce a song like this. It didn't work. Why are you? Yeah, And so that's one bird song. Another bird song might sound like this. And so even I can tell those two songs apart. I can use those songs to recognize different birds. While each song is unique, birds that are related to each other might have songs that are more similar. So for example, if this blue bird here is brothers with this other bird over here, the brother might have a song like this one. And so those songs are not the same, but they sound more similar to each other than either of them do to the red song. And the reason for that similarity is that songbirds are vocal learners. That is, they learn their songs when they're young from other birds around them. So birds that have the same father or tutor are going to have songs that sound similar to each other. So this is true not only for zebra finches, but for other songbirds. That includes crows and the Japanese tits that are here in Tokyo. There are other animals that are vocal learners as well. So hummingbirds and parrots, elephants, dolphins and whales, and bats. And of course, us humans are all vocal learners. And what that means is we have to hear particular sounds when we're young in order to produce vocalizations when we're older. This is not true for all animals. So many animals communicate using vocalizations, but they don't learn their vocalizations. And in particular, lots of animals used in research, things like rats and mice or non-human primates, will use vocalizations to communicate, but they don't need to learn those vocalizations when they're younger. So the process by which songbirds learn their vocalizations when they're young is very similar to the way that we humans learn how to speak. So I'll show you an example of what that process looks like for a pupil here on the right. You can see that his beak is still a little black. He doesn't have the stripes yet, so he's growing up. And his father, his tutor, is over here on the left. And so when this pupil is young, he needs to hear sounds, hear songs in particular, in order to shape his brain. So he's going to memorize an example of song when he's younger, and that's going to be the template that he uses for the song that he will then learn to produce. Shortly after he memorizes that song, he goes through a period of sensory motor learning. And this is a period of trial and error learning, or babbling, where he'll produce some vocalizations and he'll try to match the sounds that he makes to the sounds that he's memorized before. And so over a period of a couple of months, he'll practice his song and get better at matching his sounds to the songs that he's memorized, until he's around 90 days of age. At that point, he'll produce a crystallized song, and that's the song he'll continue to sing for the rest of his life. So this process of memorizing a template, going through a period of sensory motor practice, and then performing a motor output is similar to the way that we humans learn to speak. It's also similar to how we and other animals perform a variety of learned motor behaviors. So if you want to do anything from learn to hit a tennis ball or learn to do a cartwheel, that involves the same process of memorizing a template, practicing until you're able to perform your actions to match the template until you finally can perform the behavior. What's especially exciting about songbirds is that they have particular neural circuits that are necessary for learning and producing song. These circuits are dedicated and specialized just for song or song learning and production. So they're part of the same types of brain areas that are involved in other motor behaviors. But in the songbird, these regions are specific for learning and producing song. Now, there's been lots of study on this behavior and on these neural circuits over the last 50 to 70 years. But as I mentioned before, males don't sing just for the fun of it, but they use it in communication. They sing in particular to communicate with female birds. And females don't sing, but they do produce other vocalizations, and they can use the songs from males to recognize males and to select mates. However, we know much less about the neural circuits that are involved in that song recognition and preference in female birds compared to what we know about the neural circuits in males. And so my lab is interested in understanding what these neural circuits look like and how they're involved in social bonding and preference. So what I'll talk to you about today are first, I'll show you that female birds show individual variation in their song preferences, and that we think that that individual variation can be plastic, or those preferences can be plastic and modified by experience. The plasticity, we think, may be driven by a neuromodulator known as dopamine. And so at the end of the talk, I'll bring those three pieces of information together to talk about how social bonding can shape preferences, neural activity, and dopamine release. All right, so first things first, let's talk about female preferences. My lab has come up with a number of ways to measure what female birds like, what they like to listen to. And one of the assays that I'll tell you most about today is one that I'll describe here. So we have a female bird, a zebrafinch. We put her into a cage where she has two strings that she can pull on. If she pulls on the blue string, she'll hear playback of the song from one male. And if she pulls on the red string, she'll hear playback of a song from a speaker of a different male, this red male over here. And so we'll allow her to just pull at those strings to listen to whichever song she likes to listen to more. Of course, we want to make sure that she doesn't just like to pull on the left string. So partway through the task, we'll switch the sides that the songs come from so that we're sure that she really likes to listen to the blue song, for example, and not just pull on the left. So over the course of the test, we'll have an idea of which songs that bird prefers to listen to. If we do this sort of test on lots of female birds, we can ask them questions about different songs. So here is a picture of a bird song. On the x-axis is time. On the y-axis is frequency or pitch. And the color is indicating the amplitude or the loudness. And so you can read this almost as you would a really noisy piece of music. So this song on the left is from a male that had a father or tutor that he learned his song from. And the one on the right is from a bird that was experimentally tutored, which means that he didn't get to learn from his father, he learned from a speaker that was playing a strange song. So we think that the song on the left is a better quality song than the one on the right, because the one on the right is not sort of normal for our zebra finches. We can ask female birds what they think about these songs. And when we do the preference assay, we get data that looks like what I'll show you down here. So if a female bird pulls a lot for the song of male A, you'll see points over here on the left of the dashed line. And if she pulls a lot for the song of male B, you'll see dots on the right of the dashed line. And dots that are here in the middle indicates a female didn't really have a preference. What we find is that for these two songs, most females prefer the normal song as opposed to the poor quality song. Only 2 females actually preferred this poor quality song. So this tells us that females can recognize a poor quality song versus a better song. But we can also ask females different questions than that. So for example, if we don't ask them whether one song is good or bad, but we say, here are two good songs, which one do you like more? We find that there's a lot of variation across females in which songs they like. So each of these dots represents a different female, and this is their responses for each of these different pairs of songs that we ask them to rank. And what we find is that for each pair, some females prefer male A and some females prefer male B. So there's lots of variation in what their preferences look like. I would compare this ability to identify a poor song, but also have individual variation in preference. I would compare this to the way that we perceive music. So for example, even if you're not a musician yourself, and even if you don't play the cello, you probably can tell the difference between a really skilled performance of the cello versus one from someone who's just learning how to play the cello. So even if you don't play the cello, if I asked you which of these is a better performance, you would likely pick the one on the left. However, if I ask you a different question, so if I instead say not which of these is a more skilled performance, but which of these do you prefer to listen to, you might give a different answer. So in this case, I actually prefer the example on the right, but many people will prefer the one that's on the left, and that will vary across individuals. So there's individual differences in auditory preference, and we think that these are shaped by experience. So the kind of music that you listen to when you're younger or in your teens or your early 20s will determine the kind of music that you like to listen to later on. So what kinds of experiences do we think are important for shaping those auditory preferences? One thing that we think is important is what we listen to when we're very young. So this developmental exposure to different sounds. And a great example of this is language. So when young infants are learning how to speak, they're initially babbling, and we're often captivated watching them make those sounds. But at the same time, as they're doing that, they're learning to speak, their brains are changing at the same time. So hearing language sounds is going to change our perception of language sounds basically for the rest of our lives. This language that you hear while growing up will determine the kinds of sounds you can tell apart when you're an adult. So I myself grew up listening to English and Spanish, and I'm really good at telling apart sounds in both of those languages. However, I did not grow up hearing Hindi. And so if you play me two sounds in Hindi, even though I've given this talk many times, I'm unable to tell these sounds apart. So I'll let you listen to them. There we go. So those are, I'm told, those are two different sounds. And if you speak Hindi, you can probably tell them apart. But yeah, but I cannot. So I'll play them one more time. And this one. And that's a consequence of this language sounds that we heard when we were growing up. All right. So we think the same sort of thing is happening in our young songbirds. So, as I've mentioned, young male birds need to hear song in order to produce song, but young female birds also need to hear song in order to be able to tell different sounds apart. And one thing that we've tested that on is in listening to different kinds of songs that males produce. So our zebrafinch males vary their song performance depending on their audience. So, for example, males will sing a courtship song where he'll sing the song and he'll follow the female around and he'll do a dance. And then males will also sing an alone or an undirected song. And usually that's when the female is in the nest and the male will sing outside. And so here's what these two songs sound like. That's the courtship song. And that's the alone song. So I myself think they sound very similar. We've done measurements on them and they are different. So the courtship song tends to be a little bit faster, a little bit longer, and a little bit more stereotyped, meaning that when he tries to sing A, he'll sing A and not A flat or A sharp. Whereas when he sings alone, it'll be a little slower, a little shorter, and a little sloppier. He'll be more sharp or more flat when he sings those notes. Now, while I can't tell those songs apart, female birds readily distinguish between them. And in particular, females prefer the courtship song. So what's shown here are the songs from 14 different males and the responses of females to those songs. And so anything that's well above this 0 line means a preference for the courtship song, and well below the 0 line means a preference for the alone song. And what you hopefully can see is that on average, females generally prefer the courtship song over the alone song. Now, this is true for birds that are reared with both of their parents. So these young females have heard the vocalizations of their moms and their dads, as well as their dad's song while they were growing up. If we have other birds where we rear them just with their moms, so they hear their mom's vocalizations, but they never hear song throughout this time, they have very different preferences. So these song naive birds, the ones reared without hearing song, are shown here in blue. And these females still have preferences. There are songs that they like, but they don't match the preferences of our normally reared birds. Sometimes they actually prefer the alone song. And so what this indicates is that hearing song during development is important for tuning up the auditory system and tuning up the preferences for particular songs. So this developmental experience shapes the kinds of preferences that birds have. Experiences during adulthood also shape the preferences that birds will have. So if here, instead of talking about the bird that's here in the nest, if we talk about this adult female bird, her interactions with this male will actually shape her adult song preferences as well. So what we've found is that social bonding, the opportunity for this adult female bird to interact with a male bird, will lead to a preference for that male's song. So in this particular assay, what we did was we allowed males and females to live together for months to years, raise lots of kids. Then we tested females in a phonotaxis assay where she can move towards speakers that either play an unfamiliar song or her mate's song. And what we find is that females in this task spend most of their time near a speaker that plays their mate's song. So they strongly prefer the song of their mates versus an unfamiliar song after having spent a lot of time with him. All right, so far we've talked about how preferences are not fixed. They can be modified by individual experience. So how do we get that plasticity? How do we get that variation or change in preference that happens? One thing that my lab studies is this neuromodulator known as dopamine. So this is a picture here on the right of some dopamine producing cells shown in green that's found way sort of deep in the brain. So dopamine is produced in about 15 discrete locations in the brain. And those cells that produce dopamine connect throughout the brain to other areas and release dopamine throughout the brain. And once there, dopamine will act on receptors to affect the activity of cells in that area. So the actions of dopamine are going to depend on which cells are producing dopamine, which of those 15 discrete populations we look at, and which part of the brain they connect to. So dopamine is interesting as a neuromodulator, and we're interested in it for social bonding reasons, in part because of what's been studied in other animals in terms of dopamine. So for example, dopamine activity increases in response to things that we find rewarding or motivating, things like food or chocolate or sex. We see that dopamine is important in other animals that form monogamous pair bonds. So animals like prairie voles, dopamine is important for them to form social bonds. And finally, we see in humans that dopamine release is associated with the amount of pleasure that we get from music. And so all of these are sort of similar to the ideas that I've been talking about so far. There's a nice quote by Josh Burke at UCSF that I think nicely describes what we think dopamine does, which is dopamine provides a dynamic estimate of whether it is worth expending a limited internal resource, such as energy, attention, or time. And that's how our lab goes about thinking about dopamine. All right. So what we've found so far is that the activity of dopamine producing neurons correlates with song preference in our female songbirds. So in particular, you might remember these songs that I showed you earlier, the song from the male that was reared with his father versus the song from the male that was experimentally tutored and he produces the more poor quality song. And we know that females prefer the song on the left versus the song on the right. If we look at the activity of dopamine neurons in a deep part of your brain known as the ventral tegmental area, we find that activity of those neurons is higher for the preferred song, the one on the left, compared to the non-preferred song, the one on the right. In fact, the non-preferred song leads to activity that's not much different from just sitting in silence. So the activity of these dopamine neurons correlates with the song preference that we see in female birds. We know that those same neurons connect to a part of the auditory system that's important for learning and memory. So in particular, these dopamine-producing cells here in the ventral tegmental area connect to a part of the auditory cortex in the bird, and they release dopamine into this area. So a former student, Helena Barr, investigated whether if we manipulate dopamine in that auditory area, can we affect the preference of female birds? And so what she did was the same assay that I showed you before. She had a female bird in the string pull assay, and we asked the female whether she preferred male A versus male B. And we'll say for this example that she likes the song of male A. What Helena then did was to pair playback of this less preferred song, the song that the female didn't like, with dopamine that we put into the auditory cortex. And so we did that for 2 hours or so. And then a few days later, we tested that same female for her preferences again. And what we found was that after this pairing of dopamine in the auditory cortex with a song that the female told us she didn't like, the female actually switched her preference. So she now likes this song, this less preferred song. Okay, so I've described to you how preferences are not fixed, but they can be modified by experience. How dopamine in areas like the auditory cortex can drive plasticity in those song preferences. And so now I want to describe a last little bit of data on how social bonding affects preference and neural activity and dopamine. So this is a study from a recent PhD student, Erin Wall, and her experiment looks like this. So she had a male and a female songbird that she housed together in a cage. So these birds have never met each other before, and so they meet each other for the first time when we put them into this cage. They're inside a sound attenuating chamber, and inside that same chamber is another pair of birds. So here are 2 female birds that are in a cage sort of next door to our male-female pair. And they're separated by this, by a barrier. So what that means is that this female on the left, she can physically interact with the male and she can see him and she can hear his song. While the females on the right, they can hear the song, but they don't see that male or physically interact with him. And so we can ask, is there a difference between sort of getting to physically interact with this male and see him versus just being familiar with the song of a male? So what she did was she put the birds together and videotaped them. So we have GoPro videos of them for the first 2 hours after we put them together, and then 1 week later, and then 1 week after that. Oh, and we'll call the ones on the left the mated birds, and these ones on the right are the unmated birds. Okay. And so she looked at a number of behaviors in those 2-hour videos that she took. In particular, she looked at different courtship behaviors. So courtship singing, where the male sings and does a dance and follows the female around. This behavior called clumping or cuddling, where the birds sit really close together, and preening, where the birds clean each other's feathers. She also looked at some aggressive behaviors, so fencing and pecking. Fencing is where the birds knock their beaks together, and pecking is when they try to bite each other. And then finally, she looked at some nesting behaviors. So the alone song, nest building, where the birds collect strings and other things to build a nest, and then incubation, when they sit together inside the nest. So the very first time these birds are put together, they don't interact too much. That's what the pie chart here is showing you. So the light color is how the percent of time they spend interacting, and the dark color is when they do other things like eating or just sitting quietly. So they don't interact much, but the interactions they have are very focused on courtship. So there's a lot of courtship singing. There's a lot of this clumping or cuddling behavior. There's a little bit of aggression. And towards the end of that first 2 hours together, they start to collect nesting material and build a nest. When Erin looked a week later, there's a lot more interaction going on, as shown here in the light color gray. And most of that interaction is focused on the nest. So they're building the nest together and they're starting to sit inside that nest together. And much less courtship behavior and very little aggression. And then by the second week, again, they're interacting a lot. And they're spending most of their time sitting together in the nest. So we see this progression of behavior over the course of 2 weeks as these birds are forming a pair bond. Erin then asked what the preferences of the females look like, and she looked in both those unmated birds, the 2 females together, and the mated birds, the male and female together. And in this case, a preference for familiar song would be towards the top and unfamiliar is towards the bottom. What we see in the unmated birds is that there's actually a preference for the unfamiliar song. So just listening to a song over 2 weeks doesn't make these birds like that song more. And in fact, they like a song that's unfamiliar to them more than the one that they've listened to for 2 weeks. In contrast, the mated birds, the female that was in the cage with the male, those females strongly prefer the song of their mate. So they strongly prefer the familiar song. And so in fact, what we think might happen is our unmated females, the ones that are listening to the neighboring pair, that they may be eavesdropping on that pair, and they now know that that male has a partner, and so they don't prefer his song because he's unavailable. So they might therefore prefer the unfamiliar song. Okay. So we have an idea of how behavior changes over the course of 2 weeks as birds form a pair bond. And we know what the preferences of the song preferences of those female birds are. What Erin wanted to know was, how does the brain change over the course of those 2 weeks? How does it change in particular in response to familiar and unfamiliar songs? So she wanted a way to look at that where she could have repeated measures within the same bird. So we could look at the brain of the same bird at different time points to see how activity changes. She wanted to be able to look at the whole brain at once. So instead of just looking at areas that we've looked at before, we wanted to discover new regions that might be important. And then finally, she wanted something non-invasive so we wouldn't disrupt the pair bonding behavior that was going on. And so what she did was to collaborate with Annemie van der Linden at the bioimaging lab at the University of Antwerp, where she used an fMRI to be able to scan these birds multiple times to look at how neural activity changes. So an fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, is a way of imaging activity in the brain. And what it relies on is the idea that the blood that's circulating in our body will pick up oxygen from our lungs, and then we'll transport that oxygen throughout the body. And in order to do that, the oxygen gets carried by a compound known as hemoglobin. And what's interesting about hemoglobin is that it has a different properties when it's exposed to a magnetic field, depending on whether it is bound to oxygen or not. So parts of your brain that are more active are going to have more blood flow and are going to use more oxygen. And so these areas are going to respond differently in the fMRI scanner because the scanner can pick up that difference in oxygenation of hemoglobin. So the scanner is using magnetic fields to scan the brain, and it will pick up differences in activity based on changes to blood flow and oxygen. So it can find the active parts of the brain. Okay, so what Erin did was a similar setup to what she did when she just looked at behavior. She has her mated birds and her unmated birds. So again, the mated birds, the female interacts with the male. The unmated ones, they can just listen to his song. And she scanned them right before putting them together. So at that point, all songs are unfamiliar. She then scans them 1 week later and then 1 week after that. And in those scans, she would play them either the familiar song or the unfamiliar song. And she could compare the activity that was evoked in response to those different songs to get an idea of where activity was changing over the course of this 2 weeks. So this is going to be a video of what some of the processed images of those scans looks like. And so in gray, what it's going to do is sort of scan through the brain. So you'll see the brain will come into focus and different parts of it will come into focus. And then in color, you'll see areas that are differentially activated for the familiar versus the unfamiliar song. So red means they're a little active and white or yellow means they're very differently activated. So it looks like that. In this case, the beak of the bird is sort of over here where my cursor is. The back of the brain is here. I'll play it one more time. And so she did lots of those scans in lots of birds over the course of 2 weeks and got lots of images that looked like this one. And so I won't show you all of the data, but I'll tell you what the summary looks like. So in particular, what she found was that different parts of the auditory system, parts that are involved in processing auditory information or in learning and memory, show differential activity over the course of 2 weeks between in response to the familiar versus the unfamiliar song, only in our mated females. That's not so surprising. We expect auditory areas to change. The other thing that she found was that there were a number of integrative hubs, we'll call them. So these are not areas that are strictly sensory or strictly auditory, but they integrate information from all over the brain. So we think that these could be sort of an important first part of a circuit that's involved in social bonding and preference formation. And then the other thing she was able to do was to look at how dopamine might be modulated across these areas. And she found that dopamine is also acting in these areas when females are hearing their mate song. So in summary, what I've talked to you about today is how zebra finches are forming lasting pair bonds that rely on communication, that they show individual preferences that are modified by their own social experiences, and that we think dopamine is a key part of the neural circuits for preference learning and social bonding. And with that, I'd like to thank my fantastic lab. So I showed you data from Erin Wall, from Nancy Chen, and from Helena Barr. So all now former graduate students. My lab also works on how birds fly. And so we have a separate team that works on that. I talked about collaborators, Annemie van der Linden at the University of Antwerp. I was here with a collaborator, Yoko Yazaki Sugiyama, who's here at University of Tokyo and at OIST. She was my host during my stay here. And we work on similar kinds of questions. These are funding agencies, both Canadian and international. And then finally, I'd like to thank Tokyo College. It's been a really fantastic stay. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Actually, well, especially the latter part is not so easy to understand for well, the people from social background, for example. But I think your explanation was very clear, and you showed a nice picture so that the people can imagine what you are talking about. And I really appreciate. But especially the latter part, because my background is engineering, and I'm really curious about the actual the mechanism of these systems. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Professor SAKURA Osamu. Professor SAKURA is a professor at Interfaculty Initiative in Information Studies of the University of Tokyo. And he specializes in evolutionary biology and science communication. Actually, he has quite well, interdisciplinary mind and doing quite interesting research. he has been taking quite interdisciplinary approaches to the issue of communication in the human society. And I would expect that Sakura sensei would give a comment and ask questions from his interdisciplinary background. Actually, I just said Sakura sensei, which means sensei is a kind of title for Japanese people. It's really common way to I call Professor WOOLLEY Sala. This is common for the English-speaking world, but I just follow the Japanese tradition. So Sakura sensei, I hope you are ready to begin your comments and questions. Sakura sensei.
Yes, Mino Sensei, thank you very much for the very nice introductions. And I'm curious about how to call Sarah or Mino Sensei. Such calling might be the form as the similar mechanism or this song that's or not. That is another interactions. Okay, I'm Osamu Sakura, professor of science studies at the Interfaculty Initiative in Information Studies at the University of Tokyo. And I'm really pleased to have the comments to the very excellent talk with Sarah. And I'm also would like to convey my grateful to the Professor Minos and the Tokyo College staffs to give me this opportunity to give these comments. Okay, so I will share my slide of the comments. Well, before my comment on the slides, I would like to introduce myself briefly because it will be a little bit related to my comments. Well, currently I am focused. My background is my expertise is the science studies, science technology and studies. But originally I got my PhD with the study of animal behavior or behavioral ecology of the non-human primates. More than 30 years ago. Well, so in fact, my knowledge about the animal behavior studies has been frozen at the states of the 30 years ago. So today's lecture is very informative, inspiring for me, which makes me to defrost my old style knowledge. Well, getting my PhD in the chimpanzee studies, I shifted my researches to more cultural or the historical or social aspects of the science. And these years, mainly I have focused on the human robots and human AI interaction, cultural aspects of the human robot interactions. Well, these are pictures, the birthday card drawn by my daughter about 10 years ago. She put the chimpanzee nearest to me, so that represents my actions a little bit similar to the chimpanzees. Okay, so as I said, I could be happy to catch up the current front of the animal behavior studies by Sarah's talks. Of course, I'm really impressed about the contents of the Sarah's talk itself, but as well as I also was impressed about the development of the technology which enabled the researches. For example, Sarah used the functional MRI for the birds, and it is incredible 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, so I believe this was not impossible. And she traced the very subtle and detailed mechanism of the real circuits of the dopamines, how dopamine worked. And it is also incredible, unbelievable 20 years ago. So that is my one of the impressions from this Sarah's talk. So this also reminds me that some other perspectives of the relations between basic science and the development of the technologies. Well, it is sometimes or very often it is believed that the development of the basic science would cause the development of the applied sciences, and that would cause the development of technology. Well, the so-called such simple linear model between the development of the basic science and technology does not work anymore. So the relation between science and technology is more complicated. So the development of the technology sometimes cause the development of the basic sciences, and the science is improvement of science is cause another aspect of the technology. So the relation between science and technology is more complicated and not a simple linear models. That is one of my impressions. So I have the 3 questions and 1 comment. Of the comment is I have already said, or I have talked already the relation between science and technology. The first question is on the relation between song preference and the song bonding. And the second question is on the relationship between individual behavior and the group traits. And the third and final question is on the applicability of bird studies, implications to humans. Okay, so first question is about the relationship between song preference and strong bonding. And Sarah clearly showed the very beautiful data between the very strong correlation between the song preference and the bonding. And so I'd like to ask which is the cause and which is the result? Or maybe there are both the cause and the results. So could we imagine the existence of the so-called self-reinforcing process between the 2 song preferences and song bonding, so which is cause and effect, So if we could imagine the existence of such self-reinforcing relations between these 2 song preferences and song bonding, could we also imagine the evolution of this type of the non-adaptive characteristics, and sometimes would it cause the more big differences or the emergence of the different species of the speciations because if these self-reinforcing, self-strengthening relation between the song preference and the song bonding is very tough. We could imagine that even in the very small differences, or very invisible differences at the first stage, might be caused very big differences after the accumulation of the several generations. So this system could cause such big differences is the first question. And the second question is on the relationship between the individual behavior, individual preferences, and the group traits. Well, so the studies mainly focus on the individual characteristics of the preference and the physiological mechanism of some preferences and courtship. And so I'd like to know about if this some preferences in the individuals could proceed more several generations. Would it be shared among the several individuals? And so if so, they could sort of the cultural differences emerge among subgroups of the birds. That is the second question. And the third question is on the applicability of bird studies implications to humans. Of course, we human beings, the primates, are the biological species, and both of the humans and birds belong to the vertebrates. So we share several biological features between humans and birds. So it is quite reasonable to get the several lessons from the birds' behavioral studies, bird neural studies to the human activities or something like that. But while still there are significant differences between human beings and the birds, because these phylogenetic trees shows that these two species, humans and birds, belong to the different trees of the biological phylogenetic trees. So we should be rather careful to apply the implications, the results from the bird studies, or not only limited to bird studies. There are studies of non-human animals to imply the human beings. So this picture showed the two founding fathers of modern ethology, or the study of animal behavior. Right hand, in the right, we can recognize the Konrad Lorenz, and in the left, the Nicole Tinbergen. Both of them honored the Nobel laureate in 1973 with their third guy, Carl von Frisch. And so many of their researches, especially of the Konrad Lorenz's deep insight of the animal behavior based on his observation with the birds. And Lorenz sometimes often said that the birds are almost human beings. And yeah, it is right. I basically agree with it. But the history of biology tells us that some biological scientific insights had the very tragic history. Those data and insights was abused to the very bad political or the ideological scenes. Many of the evolutionary biology or the genetic biology or the cognitive psychologies could be implied to support to the eugenics or the social Darwinism or the racial discriminations or there's many other some patriotic or the such social bad movements. So of course we can learn a lot about the studies of non-human biologies, non-human species, but as well as we should be careful about the implications from such biological researches. So I would like to ask Sarah's comments on this point. This was my third and last comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sakura Sensei. Indeed, you asked quite interesting questions. And now I think that Salah, you would like to respond to his questions. He first gave a very, how to say, a big picture about science and its application, and then 3 questions. So, Salah, please.
Sure. Okay. So I liked commentary, this idea that it used to be sort of a linear progression from basic science on through, and that now there's this sort of feedback that comes around. We certainly get so much input from engineers and physicists, and a range of other computer science is definitely key for the kind of work that we do. And so I feel like, yeah, that feedback is actually really prominent, especially in neuroscience research these days. So I think that's a great point. Can you remind me as we go through what your 3 questions were? So the first one was about the relationship between
the playful
song preference and social bonding, right? And, you know, cause versus effect, I think was the gist of it. Yeah. So I think that for our zebra finches specifically, so I think I don't want to speak too broadly about all songbirds because they're very different depending on the kind of species they are. In our zebra finches, I think that song preference will bias them in one way or another towards forming a bond, but that the bond can often, it can often trump the preference that they have. So we've seen anecdotally examples of males that have really terrible songs, like they've learned their song from the wrong species or something like that. And yet, if that male interacts with a female and she likes him, they will form a bond together, despite that maybe if you just played his song, she wouldn't like the song immediately. But the interaction seems to be important in our zebra finches. So it's not just song preference, but the interaction matters too. But I think that's not true for, across sexual selection or across all species. I think that's a particular aspect of the zebra finches. In lots of species, preference is what would really matter. Does that answer your question? Do you have more questions? Thoughts?
Can I ask the related question? So they mentioned about you mentioned about the songbirds. So are they good learners? So I mean that the individuals with the poor songs can improve their songs in more efficiently, or is there some individual differences in such ability of the learning of the bird song?
So there seem to be genetic contributions to learning, and actually Kazuwada, who's at the University of Hokkaido here in Japan, he studies a lot of those genetic contributions to song learning. And so there do seem to be birds that are genetically predisposed to be better learners than others. There are genetic effects or family effects on learning. Right, and then for the zebra finches, that combines with the early experience. So if they could be a good learner, but if they don't hear song during that sensitive period, it doesn't matter if they were a good learner or not. They'll still produce an aberrant song when they're adults. So they need to be a good learner and to hear song when they're young.
So both of the genetic background and the environment is both of the very important.
Yeah, environment is key.
Okay. Okay, so we are going to the second question.
Second question.
Should I share the?
Yes, please.
Okay, second question is about the possibility of the
cultural differences. I think this is a great question. So I think for our zebra finches, because it's so experience dependent, we don't see mate copying in the way that you might see in other species. So that the data that I showed where the unmated pair is listening to the mated pair and the unmated birds prefer the unfamiliar song, I think is indication that they're not, at least for song preferences, they're not copying the responses of other birds. And I think that's because the pair bond is so long lasting. So you could imagine if they just paired for one clutch of eggs or for a season, that male might become available. And so there could be mate copying there. But these birds will just, remain paired for months or years. And so there doesn't seem to be that same mate copying. And then what's also interesting is that there is a beautiful study by Olga Feher and Ofer Chernikovsky, where they took birds and tutored them with isolate songs. So they had birds that didn't have a tutor, and they used that song, which is very strange, to tutor other birds. And what they found was that over time, the birds that were learning the song would try to make it better so that it was more like the species typical song. So there was this sort of cultural change in song that happened over generations that moved the song back to being more species typical. And I think that also seems interesting to me, that at least using isolate song as a starting point, you can't fully push songs in completely different directions because they seem to come back towards a zebrafinch typical kind of song. But there are lots of examples of cultural evolution of song in other birds. So in like white-crowned sparrows, you see the original Peter Marler work showed there's different dialects of song depending on where you record birds from. So there is that kind of cultural evolution. And I'm sure there is in zebrafinches too, but there's also a push towards a species typical song as well.
So could I ask a little bit more about the what is the species typical song, zebrafinch typical song? Is there some kind of the such what to say typical type of the songs, and all of these preferences and differences are just a bit of the fluctuation? Or so how do you think about the typical?
Right. So Richard Zahn, who was one of the people who really best described zebrafinches in the wild, he sort of categorized song elements into different categories. So there's like a particular kind of stack, like one of those ones that has looks like a ladder, and there's noisy syllables and so on. And he looked at lots of song, and there seems to be a general organization to it. There's certain kinds of syllables they make, and a certain order that on average, that's how they would put their song together. And yeah, and so lots of people, John SAKURA at McGill being one of them, have looked at how that influences learning. So if you give them a completely random sequence of syllables, how do they put a song together from that randomness? And they find that on average, birds will put together sequences that are in a particular order. So there seems to be some species typical shape to the song and to how song gets assembled.
That sounds quite very interesting. So the I guess that the zebra finches have some regional populations. So is there not only individual differences? Is there some such population differences, population specific songs? Does it exist?
I think there probably are population specific songs. One challenge with zebrafinches is that because we all study them in the lab, it's hard to say for sure what is an artifact of lab or like pet store breeding versus what they would look like in the wild. But it does seem like there are zebrafinches in Australia, and then there are zebrafinches on an island called Timor, and those populations have slightly different songs. So it seems like if there's some distance, you do get population differences.
Oh, very, very interesting. Okay.
So shall we go to the third question?
Third question, yes. The implications to human beings.
Yeah, so we think about this a lot because we need to pitch our work so that it is of interest to humans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that our work has to be used for humans. And so we study songbirds because we're interested in how songbirds, what their behavior and their brains are like. But I do think that there's tremendous conservation of brain organization and function across vertebrates. And so understanding how things work in birds, we can comparatively look at how that compares to, say, voles or humans or other species that also show this kind of bonding. And the similarities can tell us something interesting. I don't think that we would, we certainly wouldn't, we don't want to take it too far in terms of applying it to human behavior, but I think that we can gain some insight into how things could work in humans by understanding how it works in other species. Dopamine in particular is dopamine in the basal ganglia, so for motor function, is conserved across all vertebrates. So similar populations of cells and similar circuits are there in frogs and reptiles and birds and mammals. And so we can understand a lot about how that system works by looking comparatively across the phylogenetic tree.
That sounds very exciting and very insightful. So the as the parameterologist, it's really amazing that we know that the birds can manage very complex songs with such a very tiny, small brains. So many of the anthropologists and the primatologists are really the anthropocentric view or the primate-centric view to the non-human animal. So the large brain is the unconscious background or the prejudice for the human evolutions. But so do you think there's any possibilities that the totally different types of the evolution from the such different size of the brains? So how birds can manage such a complex behavior? What is we need such a big brains in the other side? So.
Right. It's an interesting question, right? Because if you think about the kinds of behaviors that even insects can show, so they have teeny tiny brains and not very many cells, but they can show really complex behavior. And so I think a lot of the increase in brain size has to do with like increasing our sensory receptors to some degree. So, like hands have, we need lots of sensory information coming in through our fingers. And so we've expanded brain size to gain resolution in terms of what we can feel with our fingers and how well we can move our fingers. So moving around bigger bodies or sensing things with more resolution, I think that comes along with the larger brain. But I think, yeah, I think this question of like, how do birds do so much with such a small brain has been there for a while. And yeah, they're amazing.
Thank you very much. Very insightful, thought-provoking discussions. Yeah.
Okay. If Sakura says you don't have anything else to add, then I will pick up some questions. We are getting some questions already. So the first one, actually, this question was answered somehow, but do the brother birds learn their own versions of the songs, which are quite similar to other brothers, automatically by themselves?
Right. So the idea is you can imagine the father, the tutor, is there with the offspring, and he'll do what we think is like a juvenile directed song. Well, he'll pay attention to that juvenile and kind of sing at him, and he'll elongate some of the spaces between what he sings, similar to how when we talk to infants, we change the way that we speak to emphasize particular sounds. Birds do that too. And so he'll do that for all of the offspring. And those male birds will memorize that example, but then how they turn it into their own song will vary. So some of them will have just, in the same way that we do, will have a slightly different vocal apparatus. So they might have a higher pitched or a lower pitched voice. So that could be different. And depending on how their learning goes, sometimes they might add in a sound or drop a sound that's difficult or something like that. So they'll all be close to the father's song, but not exactly the same. There's a little flourish or difference that they add to it.
Okay, I will go to the second question. Actually, I think this is a very interesting one. And the question is, have you tried to understand the meaning of the part of songs? Probably they may say, for example, let's make a nest together, if they may mate it. Nest can be a word, they understand each other. Is it possible to pick up an element of words within their conversation?
So I think in Songbirds, it's not the same as language. So they use it in communication and they can communicate emotion with it. So the courtship song that they sing is sort of like a high density or aroused song where he's doing a dance and it's fast and there's lots, it's much longer. So it's a denser song. And so that can convey arousal or emotion, but I don't think that they convey ideas necessarily. There are some species that do convey more information or different information. So chickadees produce a call, the chickadee-dee-dee-dee call, and the Ds can be used to indicate when there's a dangerous predator nearby. So if the predator is more dangerous, meaning that it's like a hawk or an owl that can fly into the tree, they'll add more Ds onto the end of their call. So they can provide that kind of information in their vocalization. But I think our zebra finches are really just indicating, at least with the song, are indicating arousal. And they have other calls that mean other things, like I'm far away or I'm closer to you. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we have had 8 questions already,
Okay.
and as long as time allows, we will go through all these questions. The third one, after listening to someone speak, we can often mentally reproduce the person's sounds, including their dialect, pitch, and timbre. And this mental representation sounds exactly the same as the actual outer simile. However, we are rarely able to reproduce or mimic how others sound. And similar scenarios occur when one tries to learn a foreign language. Considering the critical period in language learning, is it possible that the critical period involves more of the motor aspect of speaking?
That is a fantastic question. I don't have a great answer to that. One of the questions that we have is, do birds have that sort of mental representation of their mate's song in the same way? Yeah, when we hear someone's voice, we can sort of imagine all of them in that representation. And we're trying to see if birds do the same sort of thing. But it's an interesting question in terms of, yeah, if I can mentally reproduce someone's voice in my head, but I can't form it. And I think that there are people that are better at that, are better mimics, right? So like actors that do impersonations, they maintain that ability to do an accent or to mimic someone's voice. And that may be something that they had to learn to do when they were young, or it may be just that with enough practice, you can match up the sound that you hear and make your voice make that sound. So that I don't know if it's, if it's really a critical period for the motor aspect of speaking, or if it's, because in some cases it's that you can no longer hear the sound in the same way, so therefore you can't reproduce it. But if you can hear the difference, it might be that with practice you would be able to mimic it.
Okay, I will go to the next question. Does it contribute to the better survival capability or other favorite talent if an individual is a better learner than others? Does the talent used solely to select better partners?
So I think the short answer to that question is we don't really know. I think a lot of people have hypothesized that being good at vocal learning should be correlated with being good at other kinds of learning or other kinds of cognitive tasks. And I know that there are people that study that kind of question, but I don't know that they have the answer yet. But it's a great question, whether, if you're sort of good at mimicking or good at vocal learning, does that also mean that you're good at puzzles or something else?
But there are some differences in terms of learning capacity among different individuals.
Among different individuals, there's differences in sort of learning capability. And yeah, and so the question is, yeah, whether that is also associated with them being good at foraging or other kinds of tasks that they have to do.
Okay, the next one, Sarah Sensei, thank you very much for today's wonderful session. I have a question about your research, and I would be glad to listen to your comments on my question. There must be other birds singing, other birds singing typical songs. And could you let me know the reason why you choose to search about zebra finches? Thank you very much for your time and reading.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we study zebra finches is mostly practical. And so unlike, say, seasonally breeding birds, where they only breed when the day length is a certain length or the temperature is a certain amount, and they only breed one time in the year, zebra finches, where they live, the limiting resource is water. And so if they have water, they will breed. And so it makes them a good bird for having in captivity, because it's easy to it's easy to get them to breed, and we need them to breed so that we can raise them in different ways, hearing different songs to look at what learning looks like.
Okay, the next question, do female birds show the preference only in songs, not in appearance of male birds, such as their colors, body sizes? If not, the good complicated songs are the only evidence of the better, stronger genes.
So there's not too much known about the visual preferences of female zebra finches, but they do seem to prefer males with a particular strength of beak color. There were some studies that looked at if you had leg bands to identify the birds, that color mattered. I think that's been debunked, actually. But in any case, that visual appearance does seem to matter as well. And we've seen in our male birds that males like to sing to female birds that have a certain color to them. So some males like a darker gray and some males like a lighter sort of brown color. And we think it's probably also true for females that there are visual preferences as well, but we're just starting to study that.
Okay, the next one, I have two questions. The first, in the process of pair formation, how long does it take for the strengthening of singing preference to fall? This is the first question. Would you?
So we give them 2 weeks. We think that actually within the first day or two, they probably have started to form that pair bond, but we haven't tested them as early as that.
Okay, the second question, to what extent do you think the differences between male and female individuals have an effect? The individual differences in singing preference.
Differences between
to what extent do you think the differences between a male and female individual have an effect?
I'm not quite sure. Oh, well, there's more. Specifically, are characteristics in pair formation between single parent and parent raised individuals. So we haven't looked at that in detail, but that's actually a study that we need to do. So we've sort of used a hammer, as I would call it, to have birds either reared with both parents in a colony setting or reared with just one parent. But I think that there's a lot of sort of in between that we could look at, and also look at what other behaviors being reared with, a single parent versus two parents makes, or, we can adjust it so that maybe they could be reared by two moms instead. So they still wouldn't hear song, but they would have two parents. Because I think that early development, interacting with the parents is important, but we don't really have a good sense of what impact it has.
Okay, well, the next question is given in Japanese, and I will try my best to translate. when this zebra finch recognize that a certain song, they have one particular individual zebra finch recognize a song is their preference, then it sometimes does it forget the song?
So we've looked for our birds, we've tested them for a preference for their mate song and then tested them either months or in some cases up to a year later, and they still show a preference for that mate song. So it does seem that they have a pretty long-lasting memory of that song and a long-lasting preference. For some of the other songs where it's sort of two unfamiliar songs that we ask them about, I think those are reasonably stable, but we haven't tested birds too many times. If we test them 2 or 3 times, they usually show the same preference, but it depends on how strong the preference is to begin with.
There is the following questions to that, and that is that if one zebra finch recognize some song, the one does not like a particular song once, and then after that, because this has already a pair, a part mate, and then is it possible to become preference to that?
So we haven't done that. We only just got that data that shows that the females that are next to the pair prefer the unfamiliar song, but it would be interesting if we were able to show them that that male is now available, if they would learn to prefer his song. We haven't done those manipulations.
But this pairing lasts long. That's what you
Yes,
said.
in theory, that pairing would last a long time, which would make sense then for the other females to not prefer his song, since that's going to be a long-lasting
That
pairing.
can be a reason.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay, the next question, does a female bird have a chance to compare different male songs, or does she have to decide on one-to-one male basis?
So I think in the wild, they live in large groups, and so female birds should be able to listen to the songs of multiple different males, and they can interact with those males and then make decisions on who they would want to pair with. So I think that they don't have to decide immediately. I think they can kind of, get to know lots of birds and make those decisions. In our experiments, it's more of an arranged marriage where we put 2 birds together and then we see what happens.
Well, the next question, I record the bird's voice. How can we find differences between one group and another group by only their voice?
We use MATLAB, but we do a lot of measurements of the elements themselves. And so you can measure things like the fundamental frequency or the duration of different elements, or measures of entropy or how noisy it is. The mean frequency probably would tell you a lot. So there are some programs that will that are free.
So you use many quantitative measures and numbers.
Yeah. It's a big question in our field, is trying to figure out how do you quantify song in a way that represents the entirety of song, but is not, there's a lot of data in a song. So how do you compress that to be fewer variables, but at the same time to fully capture the variation that's there?
Okay. I think this is the last question we are having so far. And how does a male bird decide to which female birds to show his singing ability?
So that's a wide open question. We don't really have a good sense of, males are also choosing, like they get to make decisions too about who to pair with. And we don't know too much about how they make that selection.
Mhm.
We do know that visual aspects seem to matter, but we don't necessarily know what else about a female or her behavior might be important for him.
Okay, I think we have gone through all the questions so far, and well, the time is almost finishing, but actually 5 minutes left. So probably I would like to ask Sakura Sensei and Sara Sensei the final words, and maybe can I ask Sakura Sensei to, if you have anything to add at the end of today's event, it's time.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk and very nice discussions and a very lot of interesting questions. So I have just two impressions. The first one is the role of the dopamine. So the Sara's talks, the dopamine is very fundamental. So maybe in near futures we can get some phylogeny of the dopamines and so on. So it is also reminds me that the human brains are also the result of the biological evolution, so that we don't forget about our basic biological features. Anyhow, we are surrounded by the artificial worlds and artificial technologies. So that is my first comments. And the second comment is one of the question mentioned about the mental representations. That is very interesting comments. And so how the non-human species, animals, have such ability as a mental representation is also the big questions maybe related to the existence of the consciousness in the non-human animals. And on the other hand, it is related to how the robots on the artificial intelligence have such mental representation. So how we should treat and have the relations with both of the non-human animals and non-human artifacts. So that is related to what's the point? So it's a very big issues we need to tackle this. Anyway, so thank you very much for the very thought-provoking session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And Sara, your final words.
I don't know that I have any. Thank you so much for your comments and questions. This has been really fun.
Okay, well, today's talk is about songbirds, and in that sense, this is I would say scientific research, but as Sakura Sensei indicated, the implication to human is kind of interesting for me. And of course, I know that human and the songbirds are completely different, but still it's kind of fun to see some similarities and differences in these things. And in that respect, I enjoyed. And from a scientific point of view, actually the very interesting mechanisms are working in this Songbird society. That's something that we found. And thank you very much for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And
yes, and now when you go out and walk through the park and you hear the birds singing, you know how it is that they figured out how to do that.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank all the audience to participate in this event, and I hope we see each other in the near future in the Tokyo College events. Thank you very much.